In this video, I'm going to show you the best way to set up a nano paludarium for vampire crabs. For the build list, you'll need the following ingredients. An aquarium, that's 5 to 6 gallons. That's a good place to start. This one here in particular is 6 gallons or 25 litres. I'll leave the exact measurements up on the screen, and you'll also need a lid for your aquarium. Second, you'll need a light, and for this I'm using a Sinkor SideFix large, which fits the tank perfectly. It's an affordable light with full Wi-Fi control and is fully adjustable, so you can move it around anywhere on your tank, place it on the side, place it on the back. It works in just about any configuration you can think of. Third, you'll need some rocks. For this I'm using some red lava rock, but you can use just about anything you like. Fourth, you'll need some substrate, so gravel, clay balls, or leca, whatever you want to call it. Fifth, you'll need weed matting. If you're using gravel, you can skip the weed matting, but for clay balls or lava rock, you'll definitely need this. 6, you'll need some plants. Ferns are a good option. They love wet, humid environments, but again, you can experiment with whatever plants you like. 7, you'll need wood. Try to stick to the common aquarium woods. This piece here is grapevine. 8, you'll need some sand. For this, I'm just going to be using some plain quartz sand, but any kind of aquarium sand that you come across will work perfectly fine. And the last ingredient on this list for the time being is good old-fashioned soil, so don't bother with any fancy mixes. Organic dirt is perfectly fine. There's a couple of other secret ingredients, but we'll cover those a little bit later on in the video. And for now, we'll just jump straight into the building process. So to start this build, I'm laying down a piece of corrugated plastic. You can use aquarium matting for this if you like. This step isn't compulsory, but it's just something to protect the glass if you drop any of the rocks or any of your hardscape early on. Now you can add the first primary ingredient to the tank, which is going to be the lava rock, or whatever stones you've chosen. The goal here is to make a barrier to separate the land section from the water section, and as vampire crabs spend 99% of their time on land, it's important to follow the general rule of 80% land and 20% water. It's the golden ratio for Geosesarma species. Play around with this with a little bit of time and make sure you get it perfect, and try to get as few gaps as possible while you're setting everything up. This will just save you filling in the gaps at a later stage. As I've chosen a rather large piece of wood for this project, I'm going to be adding it in now and then building the substrate system in around it, then putting my dirt on top. However, if you're going to be doing this for the very first time, it's easy to put the entire substrate system in, put all your dirt on top, and then add the wood at the final part. This tank is quite shallow though, at 25 centimeters deep, so for me to fit this piece of wood in, this is the best way to do it. You can also follow this method if you have a very large piece of wood. I've had this in an aquarium for quite a while before, so for it to be sitting in the water to some degree isn't going to be an issue. However, if you've chosen some wood that you're not 100% sure of, definitely try to keep it above the waterline. I'm really happy with how that turned out so far, and it's looking pretty close to what I had planned in the little bit of a mock-up we done early on. So if you didn't manage to fill any of the gaps, the next step is going to be filling the gaps with smaller stones, some filter floss, some old filter foam, whatever you have. You can even use clay balls. I generally like to use a bit of whatever I can and just try and keep it as organic as possible. After you've plugged all the bigger gaps, it's time to add your chosen substrate. Normally I use the Leca clay ball option, but for this I'm going to be using this leftover red substrate gravel. I accidentally bought it a while ago instead of aqua soil, so I'm just going to be using it up for this build, plus it kind of matches everything that I've chosen so far. When adding your substrate layer to the tank, make sure you build it up about 2 to 3 centimeters higher, or about 1.5 inches higher than your planned water height. You want your water to sit about 2 to 3 centimeters below the top of the substrate, which is about 1.5 inches. This just allows any water to drain back through the soil and into the water section. If you've decided to use clay balls or lava rock or something similar, you'll need to add the plant barrier, so the weed matting, for this next step. I'm not going to be using that for this build because I'm using gravel. However, you just need to lay it on top of the substrate system just like this to get the perfect results. Once you've laid it down, you can apply your soil on top. This just prevents the soil getting into the clay balls and then contaminating your water as it filters through to the water section. The next part of the process is to add the soil layer to your tank. A lot of people like to use AGB mixes for this kind of a setup, but it's best to just use plain old soil as long as it's organic and doesn't have any fertilizer. I have a bit of a running theory at the moment that the AGB mix is a little bit too acidic and it does prevent vampire crabs from breeding. It's just a theory at the moment, but so far I've been speaking to a few people and it seems to be kind of validated so far, but I'll make a video some stage down the track once I have more conclusive results. But for now, just stick to some basic soil. Alternatively, you could make some patches in your tank with a bit of AGB mix for certain plants and some soil in other sections, but otherwise, if you don't want to spend any extra money or waste any time, just stick with soil. Okay, so after dropping in the soil layer, it's time to add our plants. I'm going to be using some vampire crab favorites here, and they are ferns. I use ferns for most of my builds. They're cheap, reliable, they like high humidity, they enjoy the moisture, and they're generally pretty tough. So if you're struggling for plant choices, stick with basically any type of fern. I'll leave the names of the 3 that I'm using up here on the screen. I'm not going to struggle my way through pronouncing them. This is my favorite part of the entire build, so adding mosses and dead leaves. So first we're going to start with dead leaves. These are one of the secret ingredients, so definitely add as much as you can to the bottom of the tank. They'll be a great place for your cleanup crew to live. Plus the crabs do eat the decaying leaves and they will hide between the layers. So in a small tank like this, layering up hides is a really good idea. It's kind of compulsory if you ask me. And moss does the same thing. So we're going to be putting our dead leaves down first, so the leaf litter layer, and then we're going to add a little bit of moss to the top of that. If you've seen any of my other builds, you'll know that I use the moss for a lot of different things. It has a lot of good purposes and it looks really good. And generally I like to use Hypnum Moss or Fern Moss, as these seem to be the most hardy that I can find. Some of the other cushion mosses and star mosses don't seem to do so well, and they're a little bit more tricky to keep alive, so avoid those if you're just starting out. Okay, so the last part before we move the tank into its final position and fill it with water is to add the sand. So we're going to be using just some plain quartz sand for this. However, you can use any type of sand you like. Black sand also works well if you don't really want to clean anything too much, but I think white sand's going to work best with this composition because it's not going to be too dark. There's a nice little bit of contrast to it. So that's the whole paludarium ready to go. So I'm going to move it into place now. Then we'll come back in, fill it with water, and add some floating plants. Obviously, you're going to need dechlorinated tap water for this. Just make sure your pH is nice and high, so somewhere around 8 is best. 7.5 to 8 is a good number to work with. However, if you're still researching about vampire crabs, I do have plenty of guides on them, so you can check out the links in the description for a ton more info. And remember, importantly, don't mix your species up. Keep one single type of Geosesarma species per tank. If you start mixing colors, you're going to start getting a lot of deaths. So for floating plants and aquatic plants in general, I like to use Salvinia. It's not too invasive, the crabs like to eat it, and it's pretty easy to come by. You can use duckweed or frogbit, whatever you've got. Doesn't really matter too much, it's personal preference. But because we're not using a filter for this build, having aquatic plants is super important. So no filter, you're going to need a lot of plants to suck up the nutrients, as well as staying on top of your water changes. For the first month or so, it's best to do twice a week for your water changes, then you can scale it back to probably once every 2 weeks. Generally, once you have a nice bit of coverage with your floating plants, you can scale things back a little bit because they'll do a lot of the heavy lifting. So the final step before adding crabs to this system is going to be adding a cleanup crew. So I'm going to be adding Springtails and Isopods to this. They are a core component and another secret ingredient. Without them, your entire setup's going to fail. They'll basically take care of any waste and process it back down to nutrients and other substances your plants can use to sustain their growth. Isopods are also a really good food source for vampire crabs. However, just make sure you keep a side colony going because your vampire crabs will eat them pretty fast. And from my experience, it doesn't matter how many you add to the tank, the crabs will ultimately eat them to extinction. That's just something to keep in mind. Before I add crabs to the tank, I'm going to be doing a quick giveaway for one of these awesome vampire crab posters. They're hand drawn by a friend of mine and come in 2 different colors and 3 different sizes. All you have to do to get one is to be the first person to guess the video game that inspired the music choice for this video. The first person to guess correctly will get an A3 size poster in their choice of color. But if you don't like your chances of guessing, you can always pick one up from the link in the description. Now we're finally going to add our crabs to finish off this build. So for this little nano tank, I'm going to be adding 3 crabs. So these are Geosesarma Halloween, or you'll probably see them commonly listed as black leg or black eye. Now there's quite a few important things I'm going to mention here. So with the crabs in a 5-gallon tank, this is about as small as you can possibly go. Generally the rule is 3 crabs per 5 gallons. However, I would stick to 3 crabs pretty much right up until you get to about 12 to 15 gallons. They breed fairly easily, so you do want a bit of space for them to grow into. I bred my first crabs in this exact tank, and I had 1 male and 2 females, and they were Geosesarma Hagen. So a setup like this works really well for breeding them, but you do need to follow the golden ratio with the sexes. So if you have 1 male and 2 females, he's going to spread his interest between the 2 females so they won't generally get bullied too hard and they won't get pestered to death. So if you have 1 male and 1 female, that male will basically hound that female until she dies of exhaustion. On the other hand, if you were to change this to having too many males, the males will basically fight to the death and kill each other, especially in a smallish sized tank like this. That said, if you only want to keep 1 crab, that's also possible. Not highly advised, but it's better than keeping 2, simply because 2 crabs is generally going to end up with 1 causing problems with fighting. Also, when you first introduce your crabs to a tank, make sure you introduce them to the land section and be prepared for them to jump. As you've seen in this video, just coaxing them out quite lightly, and the male already jumped out pretty quickly. So he didn't have far to fall, so it's not big of an issue. But just be prepared for them to jump because they are really good jumpers and they will jump so fast you won't even see it coming. And most importantly, as always, when you're getting crabs, please don't mix them up. Mixing crabs is one of the #1 reasons they die. They'll just fight each other to the death and kill each other. It doesn't always happen straight away, but it will happen over time. The dominant crab will just kill everything else in the tank. Just don't mix species and save yourself the trouble. There's a lot of other people mixing them online. They just don't have a clue what they're doing. I'm just going to be straightforward about that. So don't take any stupid ideas from that. Do not mix your crabs.